This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Birgitte Jallov is an independent communication and media specialist and the founder of Empowerhouse. Since 1980, she has worked with community radio for development, empowerment, and social change. This includes the development of a series of special tools, organization forms, and methodologies for community organizations to enact change in more than 60 countries and across 250 assignments over the years. I spoke with Birgitte in Denmark. Hello, Birgitte. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me.
Where am I calling you today?
Well, I'm sitting at home, and home is a small island in the Baltic part of Denmark.
A small island. That's fantastic. I'm really excited about this conversation. Looking through the Empowerhouse website and looking through your CV, I just think you're going to have 100 stories to tell us today. Why don't we start by having you tell us about what is Empowerhouse and how did that get started?
Empowerhouse is an initiative I started 3 years ago based on the fact that I have worked with community radio since 1980. I think I started. At the beginning, I was part of a small collective in Copenhagen and our first community radio here, and our collective was on a women's collective working with community radio in that way. And I've worked with that ever since in most parts of the world. Not very much where you're based, Stephen. Haven't been much in Latin America and Central America, but in most other places. I have received so many requests, emails, and in other ways asking for advice and support to community radio stations and sustainability of community radio stations in different parts of the world. So I decided to write a book, Empowerment Radio, and to start this initiative, Empowerhouse, that could be a basis for community radios, training for community radios, publications for community radios, and so on.
So dive a little deeper there. Explain to me, what do you mean when you say community radio? How does that differ from commercial radio or other forms?
Basically, one talks about having a three-tier radio system. The public radio, which in some countries still is state radio, commercial radio, and then alternative, group-based, community-owned, listener-sponsored, and often called community radio. The alternative radio, often low power, often covering just a geographic community of proximity, you can say, people living in a district, if it is in a developing country or in a part of a city. You have them all over the world, and they come in many different forms and shapes. And the kind that I primarily work with is the kind of community radio where a community joins forces to use the community radio as a platform to debate all of the many issues and challenges that we all have in our lives, in a platform that's ours, where we can find solutions and where we can put the people who make all these decisions to account.
I heard the term low power. I heard the term district or locality. Can anyone set one of these up? Is this, why don't you take me through that? What does that mean?
Well, first of all, of course, the question is, what is the enabling environment like? Is there a legislation which allows you to apply for a license, sending permission to actually put a small community radio or small radio on air? This is possible in many countries. In many countries, it isn't. One of the countries where I work at the moment is in Zimbabwe. Not a big surprise to those of you who follow Mugabe's doings there, but it's not possible for the population, for citizens, for groups of people, for communities to start their own independent, community-run, community-owned radio station. So first of all, you need to have a legal framework in place. In Europe in the 70s, many countries had loads of pirate radios. You found it also in other parts of the world, but I think this is one of the areas where we've had most pirate radios going on air without a sending permission. But first of all, when you talk about what does it take to start a community radio, is of course to find to have a permission to have a space. That is the way you choose to go, and most do. Then if you want to have the kind of community radio where that works for empowerment and isn't just a source of information, which is also great if there are no others, or if it is an alternative to other sources. But if you do want to use the community radio, not just as an audio channel of information, but actually as a platform for development and change, then you go through a whole process of joining hands, identifying who are we, what do we want, why do we want it? Is a community radio or a radio a way to do it? How can we organize? What are the themes? Who will do what? And so on.
So the obvious question, I think, for many of our listeners, is radio still relevant, even in these parts of the world that you've described today? Who listens to the radio? You've described the communities and such, but this hasn't been replaced by smartphones or podcasts or things like that?
That's a very good question, Stephen. I actually asked myself that question from time to time, and I had an opportunity last year to do a quite extensive study of that. And I, a real radio person, was quite surprised to see how powerful and unique radio is anywhere in the world. From James Critland, who is a London city-based radio futurologist, to people working with development in poor rural areas in Africa and Asia, the answer is there's nothing that compares to radio. Radio is something that you can make it really cheap, expensive and fine and difficult and so on. But you can set up a community radio quite inexpensively. You can reach out in a way also to populations that do not read and write. It's unique here. You can be a radio producer even though you may not have gone much to school, because in communities where many people are illiterate, oral communication is a tradition, and some of the most inspiring and fantastic radio presenters I've met actually come from rural African communities, where in Denmark we would say there's no eye that's dry, because everyone are laughing and crying with these people in such a fantastic way, telling stories. Radio, for all of these reasons, is both very powerful, it's unique, and it has a very strong democratic potential.
Wow. My mind is sort of just expanding right now about the potentials. I think it's wonderful. I'm lucky enough to have heard a very recent article in the United States on National Public Radio, funny enough. I listened to it through an online streaming system, right, through my smartphone. But they actually did an article where they went in search of just a radio. They found it really, really difficult to just find a radio. Does this technology, is it still really accessible in these places, in other countries? Or is there any fear that it will just disappear in the near future?
Based on my research and interviews with a lot of people working in this area, as I mentioned before, no, there's no immediate chance that radio will disappear. But then answering one of your other parts of your question, radio isn't necessarily something that comes out of that grand apparatus standing on the floor or on the kitchen table in the form of a transistor or so that we used to know. Radio is, in my understanding and the understanding of many, it is audio programs carried through mobile phones as podcasts. In a time schedule at 8 o'clock, at 9 o'clock, or whenever you want to listen to it. It is audio programs transmitted through a vast different variety of transmission forms. So you can say it's a hybrid technology, merging the old and the new.
Lovely. As I said in the beginning, I bet you've got a million stories. What's one of your favorite stories that you like to tell about how community radio has really had impact or really made a change anywhere you choose in the world?
Well, I have two stories when you ask me. One from rural Mozambique, country in southern Africa, and another one from Asia, from Laos, from the mountains of Shenquan. In Mozambique, community radio started really in the middle of the 90s. There were 4 or 5 radios when I moved there myself in 1998. And today there are about 100 community-run community radios. One story of change and significant development impact on people's lives is a story from an area where every year when the rainy season makes the flood burst over its boundaries, cholera is one of the results. because of everything, the dirty water and so on. And for many years, the Ministry of Health, UNICEF and other organizations, including Red Cross volunteers and so on, had tried to convince the population to put chlorine in the water and to do other things that you can do to minimize the risk of, and definitely the fatality of cholera. It didn't happen. Every year there were 300-400 that died of cholera in this small district. Then when the community radio came, the community radio volunteers there, sons and daughters, uncles, aunts, the nurse, the local school teacher, and so on, were talking about the same things. And they were doing it in the dialect of the language that was used in that particular district. They were using the cultural stories and metaphors and explanations of why things were important and how you could do things to improve your life and so on. And within a year and a half, the result was that no one died from cholera. There were thousands that were ill when the rains came and the cholera season was flourishing, but no one died.
And you think the evidence is there that it's still directly attributable to the community radio? I believe you. I just think that's fantastic.
We checked, were there any other sources of health? Were there any new nurses, any new information campaigns, any other things that had changed? And there wasn't. And we knew that the second year, the story was the same. There were fewer ill. No one died. The third year, the fourth year, the fifth year, and I stopped following it after that. But it was a significant and dramatic cut in death. This is just one example. There are many others of important community change.
That's amazing to be able to do that direct correlation. That's fantastic. You said you had another story as well.
Yes, from Laos in southeastern Asia, up in the mountains. Laos is a one-party country. It's communist, and there's definitely nobody besides from the party and the state that can own media. Nevertheless, the UNDP managed to find a way to negotiate exploratory pilot with a small community-run, state-owned, but community-run and community-produced radio. And also here in the health area, there was some of the most significant and immediate changes that could be recorded after, again, a year and a half. We did an impact assessment, and where people, ethnic people living in the mountains, didn't used to allow their kids to be vaccinated. They had very good reasons for that. There had been lots of conflicts, and they were sure that these syringes would be filled with poison. They definitely didn't want to let that happen to their children. And women didn't trust the hospital services and didn't go for prenatal care when they were pregnant. After a year and a half, and the radio had been up and running, and I'm cutting this story very short for this special edition, then you could see that 50% of all the children in the ethnic areas in the mountains had their children vaccinated, and 70% of all women went for antenatal care. Again, there were no other. We did quite thorough research with health authorities, statistical authorities, and so on. And there were no other new elements that had come into play in that district, but the community radio. Again, the same information that they had received before, but told by people they trusted, people whose credibility they had no reason to fear, and they knew that they wanted the same as the listeners wanted. I have hundreds of these types of stories, but these two stand out because of their magnitude and the difference between life and health and death, you can say.
I feel like, I know that I am, but I'm thinking many of our listeners right now are sort of salivating, because to be able to say, hey, here's my intervention, I have very clear data that it has this massive impact, or the potential for this massive impact is amazing. Where I think a lot of people's mind goes, who funds this? Are these initiatives all funded, by the local community? Are they grant driven? How does one get started with the initial funding?
There are as many answers to that question as there are communities. As I mentioned in Laos, it was UNDP that started this process, and the beginning of the work with the radio was funded by UNDP and Oxfam and a few of the other big international donors. Similarly, in Mozambique, the radio I talked about, because I worked with UNESCO and we did support the start of the station. So it did start out with UN support. But both of these stations actually managed in different ways to become not maybe self-sustainable in the way that a commercial radio could be, but sustainable through careful and by obtaining a mix of different funding sources. In Laos, for instance, all the people around the radio were rice farmers, or are still rice farmers. And they signed up as members, and most of them couldn't pay a membership due, but they could give a sack of rice at the time of harvest. And these were collected. The radio built a storeroom, and rice is quite cheap to sell and to buy. When it's harvest season, you can get much better prices for it later in the season. So they stocked it up and they sold it at a different place at a different time. Similarly, they managed to negotiate with local authorities in health and education and culture and so on, that since they, as a community radio, managed to transmit a lot of the important development messages that these departments would otherwise have had to send extensionists to do, they provided a small grant per department per month to the station. And there are lots of other ways. I will not tire you with that. But by finding creatively, depending upon the nature of the community in question, what could the different sources be? Who are the members of the community who really want this radio to stay on air? And then how can we then put together the kind of funding mix that can create sustainability? Very often there's still also some funded programming from projects, or when we talk about developing countries, projects or other development actors who need information disseminated on health, on agriculture, on women's rights, on fishing or whatever. So they can support the kind of programming. So that could be an additional part of that funding mix. Also, many stations, especially in Asia and Latin America, many stations have simply been started by communities themselves saying, we want this. And actually today you can have a community radio with a laptop and a small transmitter. It may not be very powerful, but that can be a beginning.
How did you get started in this in the 80s? And you said that you were a part of community radio in Denmark and the sort of that burgeoning marketplace. What was it about it that attracted you, though? Was this something that you knew that you wanted to be a part of, or how did you find your way into community radio?
I think all of us and most of our listeners, they know when they look back in their life, it looks like there's a nice red thread that goes through everything. It is as if it was planned by a magic hand from somewhere.
I wish that were the case.
But when you stand at the beginning of your life, actually things, I think in my life, and I think in most other people's lives, happens kind of haphazardly. I can say for myself that I was always I was part of the women's movement from a very young age. And I always had a very strong sense of the need for people to be aware of and to fight for their own rights. I lived that conviction in Denmark, and that brought me into, through the women's movement, into the movement of starting people's own radios, which were the community radios in Denmark in 1980. And we traveled around Europe to visit countries that were a little bit more advanced than us to see how did they do it and what did the women do, what did the other movements or actors in community radios do, what type of programs, how did you fund it, just like you were asking me just before, and so on. And then we built up our own little station. And as I was part of the women's conferences, both in Copenhagen in 1980, the UN Women's Conferences, and in Nairobi in 1985, I could see that there was a lot of need for the kind of experience and background that I had, the little I had at that time. And I grew gradually, step by step, into working in this area for people's rights to a voice, for also the voice of the voiceless, as we've heard so often. I'm smiling when I say it, but nevertheless, I think that's one of the very crucial bases for development of societies where people's rights are observed, and where you can, if you are not given your rights, then you can fight for them because you know what it's all about and you consider yourself somebody who has the right to ask for it. I think that's what drove me through this movement. That's where it started, and that's how it developed step by step as opportunities arose.
Two questions. First, is community radio still thriving in the quote-unquote developed world?
Community radio is quite advanced. I was just elected a member of the board of the Community Media Forum Europe, the CMFE.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much. A few months ago, and community radio in Europe is actually still a place where you fight to have a voice and different opinions aired, even in today's vastly diverse and open, you can say, information and communication market. In a country like Hungary, the people's right to a voice and to information is being limited at the moment. I'm part of a small background group in Cyprus fighting for the right to have community media. In Germany and Austria, community radios are very powerful alternatives to the national media, and very often strong minority groups and people who are, in the way that our societies function today, outside of the main information and communication streams, you can say, who are the new voiceless groups, are often very important actors in these alternative media movements. In the States, I know that the community-sponsored radio, the US and Latin America were the first on the scene in 1947 with community radio, and they are still very strong. Everything changes and is different, of course, but they're still very strong. Yes.
I'm glad you led me right there, because that was my second question, was over the arc of your career over the last 20 years or so, or actually we're looking at 30 now. What has changed? You took us through your start in the women's movement, and but it sounds like maybe the issues are still the same, or the empowerment aspect of it's still the same. Is it really just a matter of technological advances, the ability of one person to set up a community radio, as you said, with a laptop and a small transmitter? Or what are the most fundamental things that you've seen change that are available today that either make it easier or better or not so good?
Well, I think that there are still a lot of issues, a lot of people's issues that are needed, that we need to debate, and that we need our own spaces for. The internet, in some of our kinds of communities where all of us are sitting in front of a computer with fast internet, of course, can substitute some of that. But what is unique in having the kind of community radios is that it is not just somebody providing some information or you Googling for some information on the web, which is wonderful. I do it every day, many times for my work. But working in a community radio, you are a community radio who come together and you identify what are our challenges. Right now in Copenhagen, we just over the weekend had some murders. I don't know the correct English word,
but, sure.
Of a young filmmaker in a debate program about pluralism and freedom of expression and freedom of the media. He was being gunned down by some jihadist, self-declared jihadist, and a young Jewish man who was a guard in front of a Jewish confirmation. I don't remember the name and the Jewish name for it, but rites of passage of a young person. Party in the Jewish community in Copenhagen was being killed. Many more could have been killed if the police hadn't been there, and so on. I mean, we still have a lot of issues that need to be debated, and it's important that communities themselves engage. As I mentioned, I'm engaged in Zimbabwe, where community radios are not yet on air, but the fact that communities are forming themselves as groups of vocal citizens, as a organized civil society who want a radio to be their voice, their platform for debate. Even now, when they're not on air, they use WhatsApp, they use bulk SMS and so on, and engage and challenge authorities to answer to questions about decisions that have been made that the population may not think are so good, or a bridge that is flooded where the authorities don't care about the lack of infrastructure for people and so on. One of the things that I've seen in most of my impact assessments in Africa and in a number of Asian countries is that one of the results of having this kind of community platform for debate in all places, and I can say that everywhere where I have worked on this, women are being beaten up a lot less. That is usually the first thing that women say when I say, so since this radio came, what are the most significant changes? And they say, we are being beaten up much less, and our children are being beaten up much less. So you can say every community, we all have our challenges. In Copenhagen, we now have the challenge I just mentioned. We may have challenges of many different natures, of different lack of access to information. We have this challenge in the north as we have it in the south, and it can be things that deal with bread and butter, agricultural development, and so on. But there is a need for these channels still. And the magic, you can say, the community radio magic is when a community goes together. It isn't just, of course, having a small radio that does the trick, but when you work together in a community to identify the challenges and together to look for solutions and to become the agenda setters and not just those that other people make decisions for and about, then actually these type of changes that I talk about and that I feel quite passionately about, I don't think I have to say that, that is what I think, what that makes it all worthwhile and why it is important fighting for.
Along with the hundreds of great stories that you have of success, there have to be at least a few stories about when community radio didn't work or when it failed or when it went awry. Do you have one of those you could share with us, and maybe either how you personally helped turn it around or what happened in that particular situation and what you would have done differently?
Well, I have loads of those also. They're very important because we learn from those, don't we? Well, one that I was definitely not involved, that I think many of our listeners are aware of, and your listeners are aware of, is the Rwanda case, where the Radio Mille Collines, the Thousand Hills radio station, actually was the brutal, encouraging factor, the massacre. The genocide, that was a word I was looking for. The massacre of civilians. Media are being used like that all over, and it's terrible. And it can be just as effective for the negative as it can be for the good. And that is why when you engage with these types of activities and media, you have to be you have a huge responsibility. I have written about, I train, I encourage, I debate, just like many others like me, on how you can protect yourself in your own small community radio against that. Beside from these very terrible, brutal, blatant cases, there's lots of small misuse of these types of community media. Also because by definition, if you talk about a small rural community where the community may not have an awful lot of education and where the authorities are just really the big men usually, but also a few women of the local area. And it's very hard to withstand their pressure when they insist that you give special messages or that you favor their special interest in an election period or so. So a lot of the work by organizations, civil society organizations all over, community radio networks, people like myself, there are many of me around, we work very systematic ways of developing strength and capacity and insight to protect yourself. Another experience I had when I evaluated a radio project in Burundi was they were talking about all these community radios. And when I started interviewing the radios about how they were formed, who managed them, and so on, actually they were all small political radios. They were run by local politicians, which is also quite common. Another kind of interest, now I talked about the political takeover, is also economic takeover, that there are people with economic interests that can take over the community radios, or in Niger in West Africa, where there are a little bit more than 100 community radios. The air has a little bit gone out of the community movement, and some of these vacant radios, this vacuum that has been left, has been taken over by mullahs, and they have actually become sources of sprouting, or that's kind of mushrooming radicalization, Muslim radicalization. So there are lots of examples of community radios where actually things have gone wrong. And just like when you work with any kind of communication activity, you have to be very responsible and very much aware of the power that you have in your hands, and build codes of ethic, boards of directors, inspection committees of especially trusted people in the community that can come in and say, oh no, now you are developing in the wrong direction. You can do a lot of things to protect the freedom and the beauty of this tool for empowerment and development. And you really also need to do that because, as you say, there are many examples also where the beautiful aspirations actually were taken over by other interests.
What do you think the next 10 years holds for community radio? Is there an important technological change? Is there a programmatic focus? Is there something that you see on the horizon that's going to be radically different? Or do you predict that, 10 years from now, you'll still have the same kind of challenges and the same type of development?
Well, technologies change. It's obvious now that 10 years ago in a rural area, when you talked with the audiences of community radio, they would say, well, I don't have a radio myself, but my neighbor has. So I visit my neighbor when the women's rape program is on or when the agriculture program is on, because I really like it. And then we listen together. And there was not a lot of adherence by youth, because this was something that the old people did or that the parents did and so on. Today with the mobile phones, actually the possibility to reach youth, which was a strong desire 10 years ago and very complicated to actually achieve, has become much more likely, because the youth have the mobile phones. They listen to the community radio on the phone. Those who have access to computers listen to the radio on the computer and so on. So this will develop also in terms of having the kind of two-way dialogue that has always been a desire by community radio. It has often actually been a de facto reality, but also very often it hasn't. The radio has just been a one-way information tool, which is, as I said before, much better than nothing. But with these new technologies, there are many different applications that have been developed where people can either write SMSs and contribute their views and thereby become a part of a program, or for people who either don't prefer to write or cannot write, can also send voice messages. It's being used quite a bit at the present time, but very often also underused, because it requires that then there is somebody at the station who will then systematically collect this information that is generated. But it is an opportunity, and I'm sure that will be further developed. So you can say even more voices on air, even more experiences and opinions, sources of stories, and to inform stories. I'm sure there will still be a lot of reasons in many countries and communities to fight for the right to actually have your own voice and your own medium. So I don't foresee the big dramatic revolutionary transformation or change, but of course the gradual possibility for increased access, but also the limitation from the powers in place in many countries and realities.
Birgitte, I always ask this last question to every guest here in terms of reference. You have managed to create success. You have a wonderful story, a great career arc. If you were to talk today to someone who's either interested in beginning a career in this type of development assistance or someone who's transitioning from another career into this, what's that one critical piece of advice that you'd give them about how to be successful or how to create a sustainable and satisfying career?
That's a very good question. I've thought about it, and I'm actually asked that question quite frequently. If we're talking about a young person coming straight from university, I get mails from young people who have heard about what I'm doing or found me on the web or so and say, I want to be like you. How can I do that? And what I've done myself and what I would always recommend, and I've seen that work for many people, is to, close your eyes and find out what makes you really happy. Because I think that the more happy you are, the more passionate you can be, the better you will be, and the more chances will open for you. Now, this is, of course, a given when you say people who already have made that decision and decided to change career. I think that to begin, it's very useful to modestly, maybe on a volunteer basis, if you don't already have a whole family, but you are a young person, to work, to build up some experience in different ways through volunteering or through adding some aspects to a job you already have, finding a way of actually getting some experience. Because the tough reality is that it's quite hard to enter without any kind of experience. But there are many things that you can in your past, if you are already an experienced person, that you can highlight those aspects that have to do with participation, with mobilization of communities or groups of people, with training and facilitation of processes, with experience with civil society work, There are many professional aspects that all make up the kind of profile of a person working with communication for development. I would say that the most important personal feature, element that I have always been looking for when I've been employing people to work in this area is humility and respect for other people. So passion, humility, and respect.
Sorry about that. Birgitte, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation, a great remembrance and reintroduction into the power of radio. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from 8preneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.